Now,
to get everybody into the holiday spirit, tonight's lesson is perfect. And I called it to sue or not to sue. That is the question. We're going to go into chapter 6 of the first epistle to the Corinthians. We're going to talk about Paul's rebuke of the Corinthian church for members of the church going to the secular judicial system and exposing their dirty laundry, their lawsuits in front of the non-believers. And this lesson follows last week's lesson where Paul rebuked the Corinthians for tolerating a member of their church who was involved in an incestual relationship with his stepmother, and for not exercising authority and power to expel the errant brother from the church. The lesson last week taught us that God expects his church to be and remain pure and holy. Paul emphasized the necessity for the Corinthian church to take actions necessary to protect the purity and integrity of the church. The church is supposed to be a light to the non-believing world. Tolerates in terms of social justice and immorality within their membership, then that sends the wrong message, the wrong light out to the world. And it also causes sin to exist within the church. And one thing we've learned about our study of the Bible is sin is contagious, it's infectious, and it spreads. And so Paul was really concerned about the purity and holiness of the church. Paul's message last week was relevant to the Christian church today, especially when churches in this age exercise the same tolerance towards the sin which the secular society advocates. We have churches accepting homosexual pastors. We have churches accepting all sorts of social things that are contrary to the Bible. We even have the Pope now supporting abortion rights. And excommunicating priests who advocate Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, where Paul is addressing the problems within the church that divide them, problems within the church that cause the church to splinter apart, and also problems which cause the church to not shine a pure light on the Gentile world. So tonight's lesson just goes along with that, where he is talking about these members of the church, the Corinthian church, that are going into secular court system to litigate their claims against each other. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that believers should make every effort to resolve directly or to submit disputes and legal claims against each other believers in the church to church authorities, and should consider filing lawsuits against other believers only as a last resort, and after considering what impact asserting their rights and claims will have with their relationship with God and maintaining peace among the believers. These are important criteria that most people, including some believers, don't even consider when they think about suing another believer. The outline of what we're going to cover tonight is Paul rebukes members of the Corinthian church for taking each other before secular authorities to resolve civil disputes. We're going to start with an introduction to a lesson. Then we're going to talk about how civil lawsuits were handled in the secular authorities by the Romans and the Greeks in the first century. And then we're going to talk about how civil disputes were resolved by the Jews during the first century. And then we're going to get into tonight's lesson, the focus of it, how Paul believed that church members should handle their own civil disputes. And then really interesting discussion questions. So the study itself, Paul rebukes members of the Corinthian church for taking each other before secular authorities to resolve civil disputes. By way of introduction to the lesson, the title to tonight's lesson is a parody taken from Hamlet's soliloquy when he was contemplating taking his own life. Dealing with his uncle's treachery in murdering Hamlet's father so he could become king, Hamlet believed that his own death was better than living with what his uncle had done. Many of Shakespeare's plays dealt with injustice and parties taking their claims before secular authorities. In The Merchant of Venice, the Jewish merchant Shylock took his claims against Antonio before the Duke of Venice. Throughout history, governing authorities have attempted to establish a process for resolving claims and disputes between its citizens. Civil claims arose from the right of an individual being violated. Oftentimes, these rights were associated with ownership of property. They arose from disputes between parties for failure to perform or live up to agreements, or they resulted from personal injuries caused by other persons. All societies deal with these type of civil disputes in one way or another for one reason, if not for any reason, is to keep the peace. Because without a system of justice, then people would take the law into their own hands. And in many cases, we have in the Bible the cities of refuge, where if you killed a relative, the family members of that relative would often take an eye for an eye and go out and seek to kill you, even if it was an accidental or a negligent cause that caused the injury to the other person. So they had cities of refuge to protect people that they committed a wrong, but gave a chance for the judicial system to process the claims. Injuries suffered by an aggrieved party triggered not only emotions of fairness, but many times generated demands for retaliation. The failure of secular authorities to provide a means for resolving these disputes would result in the parties seeking to help themselves to the justice they deserved, and it would eventually destroy the peace in the kingdom. Moses, if you recall, when we studied the book of Exodus, was so burdened by hearing claims brought before him by the Israelites in the wilderness that his father-in-law suggested.
Okay, I'll probably get 2 recordings and I'll combine them.
Okay.
Go ahead.
We were talking about Moses being so burdened by all the claims being brought before him to decide with respect to the Israelites in the wilderness, that when Jethro, his father-in-law, came to visit him, he suggested that Moses delegate this authority to tribal leaders and people that were high up in the Israeli society. Many times you'll see that in Old Testament times and even in early medieval times in England, the king would be sitting most of the time hearing civil claims, hearing claims from one person against another that were brought before the king or against a ruler. In our country, our judicial system provides an elaborate court structure with rules and procedures, statutory and regulatory laws, and a history of case law, which we refer to as common law, which provide a venue for people to seek justice to resolve their claims. Despite the system of justice which is available to resolve claims between individuals in our society, the ability for the court system to peacefully resolve disputes depends upon the perception of fairness by those who seek to resolve their claims using the court system. I can't think of any period greater than the period that we're going through today, where people are questioning the legitimacy of our judicial process. If the Supreme Court decides in a way that people disagree with, they want to go and attack the Supreme Court or pack the Supreme Court or eliminate the Supreme Court. If people don't get what they want in court, they go in endless appeals. Our system, a lot of people believe it's a two-tiered system. There's justice for some and not justice for others. Some people believe that there's justice for the rich. You get all the justice you can afford, and the people that are poor do not get any justice at all. Now, the next part of what I want to talk about with respect to our judicial system is that there are a number of common sense maxims which lawyers today often consider whether to represent a client and to decide whether to sue or not to sue. One that I learned very early in practicing law: never expect justice to be served in every case. You're going to get burned in court. You're going to see a case where you just don't agree with the ruling of the court. My dad said, rarely are you going to see justice in every case. You'll be lucky if it averages out to have justice over a lifetime.
Wow.
Another thing that lawyers consider: a poor settlement is better than a good lawsuit. people are always better off settling their claims than they are putting the claims before an independent third party, whether it's a judge or whether it's a jury. Oftentimes, there's always something that comes out when third party decides a case that is completely different than what you expect when you submit the case to their review. Another maxim that lawyers follow is never base the validity of a case based upon a client's opinion or a client's version of the facts. Lawyers are required by rules to investigate what their client tells them, to seek and provide evidence that supports the client's claim. To go into court merely because your client thinks he has a case is close to committing malpractice if it's not being plain crazy. Some lawyers say that when you're involved in a legal case, you have 3 enemies, maybe even 4. You have the other party that's involved in the case. You have the lawyer representing the other party in the case, and you have the judge. And sometimes your worst enemy is your own client. And so when I was taking a class in continuing education dealing with family law, the teachers of this family law class would say, when you get into a hospital operating room, you have the nurses and you have the doctors and you have the all the people in the room. They're all working towards a common result of trying to save the patient. He says, if you get a bunch of lawyers and clients and judges in the same room, they're all trying to kill each other. Another maxim that lawyers following before deciding to take a case or sue is never file a lawsuit based upon principle only. I can't tell me how many times clients say, well, I'm not suing for the money, I'm suing for the principle. Which my response, trained after many years of experience, is you better find yourself another attorney, because you're not going to get your principle satisfied in court. Now, there are cases that are filed on principle. The American Center for Law and Justice is a law firm that basically represents Christians and represents people that are believers in cases against the government where they have been their rights under the Constitution for practicing religion have been violated. They recently represented the baker in Colorado, where a homosexual couple came in and asked the baker to use his skills to craft a wedding cake for the homosexual people to celebrate their marriage. And he refused to, saying, I'm a Christian and I don't believe that I should use my skills for that purpose. The state of Colorado went against him, fined him $240,000. He appealed all the way to the Supreme Court and won the case, only to have, after the case is over, a transgender family come in and ask him to do the same thing for their wedding. And so the legal system is being used to destroy religious freedom in this country. And that's the American Center for Law and Justice is a firm that deals with principle, fighting for the constitutional rights of these people. Those are the cases, but most civil cases where somebody's saying I got cheated on a contract or somebody damaged my property or I was in an automobile accident, those aren't cases about principle. Those are cases about money. Another maxim that is used is that never file a lawsuit without being paid or having a high probability of being successful, in which case the lawyer can be confident of being paid from the outcome. The worst case to ever be involved in is a case where the other party is not paying their attorney, because the attorney is dragged into doing more and more things, and you have to charge your client to respond to everything the other attorney's doing. The other attorney's doing it pro bono, and you're doing it for money, and your client's complaining about your fee. So money is always a problem between an attorney and a client, and it's better just to say, look, the only way that I can represent you is to have a prospect of being paid for my services. I will say something that is not very complimentary to Christian clients is that, with the exception of recent experience I've had with Christians, most Christians expect a lawyer to do and represent them for God and not for money. And I can't tell you how many times that has become part of a problem. When I first started practice, I advertised as a Christian attorney, and all I did is attract people that wanted me to serve God by representing them in court. And frankly, if I had done so, I would have not been in business as long as I have. So it's important that people get paid for their services. The rule or the maxim that's followed is lawyers need to take care of themselves and stay in business instead of just doing things for pro bono. There is a lot of work that lawyers do for pro bono. I volunteer a lot of time to the legal services for pro bono work, but that's something where I choose to do something that's for people that cannot afford a lawyer, and the state bar sanctions it. Another thing is avoid disputes between churches and their members or between members of the same congregation. Some of the most vengeful, wrathful, venomous cases that I've ever been involved in are cases where members of the church are suing each other or suing the church. Paul, this lesson addresses that problem tonight. Those problems should be taken care of by the church, under the authority of the church. The redress in our legal or secular court system, all the things that we're going to study tonight come about when members of a church sue each other or they sue the church. Now, another maxim, and the last one, there's many, I just pared it down to these. A sign that a settlement or a resolution of a case is a good settlement or a resolution is that neither party is happy with the result. Oftentimes, you'll never satisfy your client, make them completely happy with anything that happens in our legal system. A sign that it's a good settlement or good resolution is when both parties are equally unhappy with the result. And so these are kind of comical maxims that lawyers follow. But if you want to look at the area of malpractice and disbarments and problems that lawyers have with the state bar and the Supreme Court with regulations, it's not following these maxims. These are danger signals for a lawyer. And if you want to violate any of these maxims, you should have a pretty good reason for doing so. Now, in this lesson, Paul rebukes the members of the Corinthian church for taking their legal disputes before secular authorities and declares his own maxims regarding how church members should resolve their civil disputes. So let's go into, generally speaking, how lawsuits were handled by the secular authorities, the Romans and the Greeks, in the first century. Throughout the Roman Empire in the first century, provincial Roman governors or their equivalent exercised judicial authority to resolve disputes which arose between parties who lived within their jurisdiction. We just got through with the study of the book of the Gospel of John, and we went through the way that the Pharisees brought their dispute about Jesus before the secular authorities, and how Pilate, the Roman governor, was personally involved in making adjudications with respect to that case. And we saw how Pilate was actually blackmailed into handing Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified because he was afraid that the Jews would go over his head to the Caesar as they'd done in the past, and that he would lose his job over not responding to the Jewish demand for Jesus to be crucified. These grievances were heard before secular governing authorities on a daily basis. In the case of the trial for Jesus, the Pharisees hurried to get Jesus set up for trial so they could run over to Pilate first thing in the morning to be the first thing on the docket. And so one of the main functions of a governor or a proconsul in a Roman colony or city was to decide civil cases and in some cases criminal cases. If the secular authority did not render his decision by himself, the secular authority would often call juries to decide the cases for them. The Roman governor or procurator would sit on the bema. We heard about this in the city of Corinth. There's a judgment seat called a bema seat where the proconsul would sit, hear cases, listen to the evidence, and make decisions, judicial decisions. Now, juries consisted of those who showed up and volunteered to participate. They didn't send out questionnaires asking people to fill them out and then try to qualify a jury. In this period, in the first century, people were very interested. They were very litigious, and they really got involved in the judicial system. They volunteered to be juries. They volunteered in the mass. They would show up all the time, and usually whoever showed up, you're part of the jury. In some cases, and in historical records, revealed that in many cases the number of jurors would exceed 100 volunteers that came to just observe the case and became jurors to decide the case. In some cases, the number of jurors exceeded 1,000. And there's records of cases in Athens where there's a jury of 1,000 people. And how would the jury make its decision? They had a vote. They poll the jury, and majority wins. So you could have 501 against 499 jurors, and the 501 jurors decide the case. Very rarely was it legal precedent wasn't relied upon. These cases were fact-driven, and often orators or the elegance of the person that was bringing the case before the jury would prevail, because their eloquence is so great that they just had to accept the truth of what they're saying. In the first centuries, the Greeks were, like I mentioned, were very litigious. They loved the court system. That was part of their entertainment. It's almost like when we get a very unusual case, the O.J. Simpson, or some of these other cases where they have public trials, people are glued to their TV sets watching these cases. Well, that was the way it was back in these times of the first century. Now let's talk about how the cases were resolved by the Jews. In the first century, Roman or secular authorities allowed the Jews to handle their own civil disputes. Pilate told the Pharisees, "You take care of this matter with Jesus. Of what concern is this to Rome?" And they basically delegated or relegated to the Jews to handle all of their own cases. In order to decide a case, the members of the synagogue would consult with and rely upon the scriptures. The Jews believed that the laws of Moses covered every kind of dispute, including what remedies would be given. You ever ask your question why God gave Moses all of these laws that we found and studied in the book of Leviticus? They're so tedious that you couldn't even remember them all, and they're very detailed. Well, the Jewish people in their synagogues would turn to these scriptures, the Old Testament, and they would find in the Bible a resolution of the case that was brought to before them between Jewish members. Women were not considered as credible witnesses. And in order to prove a point in court, typically they needed two credible evidences before they would accept the truth of a matter. In fact, this practice of bringing cases before the synagogue was so important to the Jewish people that they considered it blasphemy not to take the case before the synagogue and apply the law of Moses to decide the case. It was blasphemous because God provided in the scriptures how to handle these matters, and not to trust God with handling these matters was blasphemy. It was a way of discrediting God. So now we talked about how the civil authorities handled their cases. We talked about how the Jews handled their cases. Now we're going to talk about how Paul believed that church members should handle their own civil disputes. Paul rebuked the members of the Corinthian church for taking their legal disputes before the secular authorities. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1, "If any of you has a dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints?" He's saying, how dare you? Paul was concerned about the Christians airing their dirty laundry before the Gentiles. Paul was concerned about how the reputation of the church would be tarnished by church members handling matters in the same way the non-believers handled their disputes. Can you imagine having matters that could be taken care of by the church, taken before a secular authority with a jury of 1,000 in a public square, and two members of the church just going at it with each other? That how the reputation of the church would be tarnished, and how the Gentiles would look at what the two members of their church are doing and saying, they're no different than we are. Their arguments are just the same. So why they consider themselves special or under the authority of God? More significantly, by letting secular authorities or pagan jurors decide and resolve disputes, the believers are placing their faith, trust, and lives on pagan values instead of trusting in God. And so Paul was picking up something that, again, Paul was a Jew. Paul was a very educated rabbi. He knew the law of the Old Testament. He knew how the Jews dealt with their civil cases, and he felt the Christians should be no different. Within their bodies, they should all decide their own civil disputes. Paul instructed the believers in the Corinthian church that God had given them the authority and the responsibility to resolve their own disputes instead of turning them over to secular authorities. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, Paul writes, "Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life?" He's saying that in the future, that those believers are going to participate in the judicial system that will exist during the millennium. And he's saying, if you're going to decide those cases in eternity, how are you disqualifying yourself from deciding the trivial cases of this lifetime? And so, while Paul's reference to believers ultimately being given the authority to judge the world is not fully understood or clear in the context of what Paul's saying in this scripture, many scholars believe that when Jesus returns to establish his millennial kingdom on earth, the saints will play a role in judging those of the world during the millennium. And you see this in the book of Revelations, where the saints join with Jesus in the millennial rule, dispensing justice. And we're not quite sure how that works or what the extent of that authority will be. But we know that the apostles and the believers are going to be part of ruling in the millennial earthly kingdom of Jesus. These scholars believe that the saints will participate in administering justice during the millennium by dispensing administrative and judicial authority on earth, and not rendering eternal judgment for sin, which will be rendered by Jesus. We're not talking about judgment of being forgiven for sins, being a believer, or being sent to hell. That judgment is exclusively reposite with our Lord Jesus Christ. But we are talking about some role that the believers will play in the judicial system, in the judicial economy of the millennial kingdom on earth. Paul also makes reference to the saints judging the angels, which most scholars believe is a reference to the saints imposing judgment against the fallen angels, joining with Jesus' judgment, condemning the fallen angels to eternal punishment in hell. Some scholars, I read some materials that talked about, are we really going to be judging the angels that are serving our servants or messengers of God in heaven? There's really no clear authority on that. Most scholars will say that when the saints are under the altar saying, "Lord, when are you going to judge all the people on earth for committing all these atrocities, even murdering the saints that here are at the altar," that we're going to participate either by an amen or by some other means of joining with Jesus condemning the sin of this world and the angels that are fallen, that are being condemned to hell. Paul is referring to that only to emphasize the point that there are greater judicial authority that you're going to have in heaven and in the millennium. And it's going to be much greater than what you're called to do and the authority that you already have on earth to decide these trivial cases. So it's a matter of authority. God is going to give you authority in the future. Certainly you have authority to handle things on earth. Paul instructs the believers in the Corinthian church to appoint their own judges, criticizing the believers for their hypocrisy and inconsistency in claiming to be wise, but not wise enough to handle and decide their own disputes. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 4 to 6. Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of non-believers. Paul is saying, you are bragging about being so wise. You're bragging about being so spiritual mature. Isn't there just one single person wise enough among you to handle these disputes so it doesn't have to be taken before secular authority? Paul's sarcasm here is just almost comical in the way that he is saying, you on one hand, you're saying you're wise, but you don't feel like you're competent or have the authority to handle these matters and keep it out of the secular courts. So after rebuking the believers in the Corinthian church for taking their legal disputes before secular authorities and not resolving the disputes with their own congregation, Paul now questions the individual believer for pursuing their claims against other believers in the first place. Paul is making a transition in his argument about how the church and members of church should handle their legal disputes with one another. First, he criticizes the church for not taking upon themselves appointing judges and resolving these disputes within the body of the church itself. Now he's making a transition to the members themselves, the individuals that have these claims against each other. And starting with verse 7, Paul writes, the very fact that you have lawsuits among you means that you've been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wrong? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. Paul is stating the fact that the believers have disputes against other believers, which must be decided by third parties, is already a matter of shame or defeat. Paul is saying, this is what's dividing you. You people have disputes against each other, yet you're both believers in God. Instead of trusting God, you're asserting your rights over the rights of another person. You're pursuing your claims against another brother in the church. You're already defeated when you do that. Why are you defeated? Because you're not trusting in God. You're not dealing with this as but is Paul saying that believers should not have disputes against other believers? Well, in a perfect church, that might exist. But you get two people in a room and you get an argument. If you have three people in a room, you have to worry about which side that third person will be with. You'll be on one side or the other, and maybe you'll have three arguments. So people just don't get along with each other. They have disputes all the time. And believers enter into contracts with each other. Believers enter into marriages with each other. Believers do all sorts of things of business transactions. Believers are involved in negligent actions against each other. Even the church may fail to de-ice the parking lot, and somebody like bfry slips and breaks their head open. These are problems. Is Paul saying that no matter what the problem is, believers should not assert claims against other believers? Or is Paul saying that believers should make every effort to resolve their disputes with each other without taking the matter before third parties? Paul concludes his rebuke against the individual members of the Corinthian church, essentially telling them that it is better for them to forfeit their claims and rights against another believer and trust God to provide his blessings instead. That's powerful. We're going to talk about that because in all my years of practice, lawsuits evoke emotion. People have rights. People have things that they believe they need to do. If not, that people are damaged by what happens in a breach of a contract. People are damaged when they're injured in an automobile accident. And if it happened to be against another member of a church, are they to just walk away from their claims? This is one of the things that Paul is telling the people of the Corinthian church back then. We're going to talk about it in just a few minutes. I hope that this lesson opened your eyes as to the issues that Paul was addressing with the Corinthian church in the context of how the legal system worked in the first century. And Paul's concern about having the church air its dirty laundry in front of Gentiles and juries who basically would decide cases based upon oratory, passion, maybe knowledge of a party or not, without any kind of system that protects them, protects the litigants from this kind of bias or prejudice. Plus the tarnishment that goes with church members fighting each other and having to have that fight publicly viewed by Gentiles who Paul was trying to use the church to bring a light of the gospel to people that didn't believe in Christ. Paul also was looking at the internal purity of the church and how these disputes between the memberships divided the Christian church, divided the church in Corinth, caused people within the church to be at war with each other, literally. Paul was saying it's better to walk away from the claims than destroy the church or destroy the fellowship or peace within the church. Now we're going to get into the discussion questions to talk about this message that Paul gives to the Corinthian church and how it should apply or might apply to Christians today and church members today. Conclusions, I guess.
All right, we're recording.
As far as implications, conclusions, and applications, when Paul wrote his epistle, the secular court system was administered differently than the court system which we as Americans are used to relying upon to resolve our legal claims and disputes. Paul rebuked members of the Corinthian church for taking their legal claims before secular authorities to be resolved and decided. Paul was concerned about the reputation of the church being tarnished by believers relying upon secular authorities and exposing their dirty laundry to non-believers. Paul was also concerned that by asserting legal claims against each other, a believer was not only creating division between members of the church, but also was showing a lack of trust in God. Unlike the early Christian church, which had many Jewish scholars knowledgeable of the law of Moses, churches today do not have the knowledge of the legal precedents or rules of evidence and procedure used in secular courts. While such knowledge may not preclude church authorities from making godly decisions to resolve legal claims or disputes between its members, the lack of such knowledge makes it more difficult to render just decisions. Paul's response to believers suing each other in secular courts teaches us to consider unity within the church body and our relationship with trusting God as significant, if not the most important criteria to determine whether or not we as believers should take our brother to court instead of trusting God by forfeiting our rights and legal claims against fellow believers. Believers should consider whether asserting legal claims against other believers is following Jesus's instructions to walk an extra mile in order to give testimony of our faith and trust in God.
Okay.